what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So as the Arctic is melting, and particularly the Greenland, and then the vast Antarctic ice sheet, that is contributing to sea level rise around the globe.
I believe that in the Arctic, sovereignty equals security. That means respecting the sovereignty of others while also being able to defend and enforce your own sovereignty.
Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Thank you to Dataminr for sponsoring Season 4 of Maritime Nation. Let's jump right in. We're honored today to be joined by Sherri Goodman and Luke Coffey. Sherri is here with me in the studio. Luke is joining us remotely from his office. Sherri is a lawyer and a leader in the fields of national security, climate change, energy, and science. She is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. Ms. Goodman previously served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense from 1993 to 2001. Whereas Chief Environmental Safety and Occupational Health Officer, she oversaw an annual budget of over $5 billion. Her book, right here, Threat Multiplier, Climate Change, the Military, and Fight for Global Security, was published in August 2024, and it's great. Mr. Luke Coffey is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he works on national security and foreign policy with a focus on Eurasia, NATO, and transatlantic relations. As a commissioned officer in the United States Army, Mr. Coffey was stationed in Italy with the Southern European Task Force. In 2005, Mr. Coffey deployed to Afghanistan, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. Mr. Coffey then worked as senior special advisor to then British Secretary Liam Fox at the UK Ministry of Defense. Mr. Coffey's commentary is widely published, and he has testified before the U.S. Congress on NATO and Arctic security. Thank you both for your service, and thank you for both being here with us today. Let's start by taking the temperature in the Arctic. What have the reactions been in your respective circles to the new administration's interest in Greenland and Canada? I'll start with Luke.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me on this excellent podcast. It's a privilege to be here and to talk about such an important issue of Arctic security and other Arctic-related issues, and at such an important time. As you can imagine, amongst my circle of friends, whether in Greenland and Denmark or in Canada, there's been a mix of emotions and reaction to what the president has said recently. There's been surprise, there's been concern, there's been laughter, there's been a mix of these different, a whole range of emotions. I would say with Denmark and predominantly Greenland, because of course you have to speak about the two together, since as I'm sure we'll discuss, they have a close relationship in that Denmark has control over Greenland in the same way that the U.S. has over Puerto Rico or Guam, right, as like an overseas territory.
Yeah.
They at first, the Greenlanders I speak to at first quite like the attention because anything that puts Greenland on the map brings the higher profile of Greenland they see as being good for business prospects, investment opportunities, tourism as well. There's an increasing number of cruise liners that are going up to Greenland. This June, for example, there'll be the first direct flight from North America to Greenland since the 1990s. United will be flying out of Newark Airport, I think it is, a few times a week over the summer. So they like the attention at first. But then that kind of evolved into concern because unlike in 2019 when President Trump first mentioned this idea of purchasing Greenland, This time, it hasn't quite gone away or disappeared. It's a reoccurring theme that we keep hearing from not only the president, but those around him. So right now, I would say there's a mix of concern and puzzlement by what his true motives are. As for Canada, I think the best way to describe the reaction I am getting is hurt. Many Canadians see the relationship with the United States as a very important and very close one that is like a family. They have sacrificed and worked alongside U.S. service personnel in many places around the world. They've always been there for us. And they get the jokes about that we have, south of the border here in America about Canada. They laugh at them too. But I would say they're hurt by some of the reactions that or some of the comments they're hearing, to the point where now it's being taken literally and quite seriously in Canada, which is having an impact on almost every aspect of life, whether it's Canadian American intermarried families with Canadians who are, working in the United States that are now fearing for their visa status. And I have a friend who's in this situation. Or we see this on professional sports with the Four Nations hockey tournament, where Team USA the anthem was continuously booed in Canada, and at every NHL game over the past few weeks, the American national anthem has been booed. When before, I've attended NHL games in Canada, and Canadians are singing the American national anthem in the past, and now that's being booed. So I think right now Canada is in this holding pattern with their electoral cycle, and the dust hasn't quite settled on what the situation how the situation will materialize. And they're waiting to see what their elections bring. They're waiting to see if Trump is going to follow through with these tariffs. But everyone, I would say, is hurt when it comes to the rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, growing up with Canadian roots, I can tell you that Canadians are typically really nice people, and part of North America, part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Some of the things that concern me are, automotive parts and lumber. We're going to have to rebuild LA, and so that's going to be expensive. And the tariffs are on hold, and there have been concessions. So part of this might be, let's see what concessions may be made before we come to a final deal, because everything is a deal nowadays. But yeah, I'd like to see us try to put this, by the wayside and move on. Clearly, Canada, and even my friends in Canada will admit they need to do more in defense, and they've clearly underspent for a number of years. And although the Canadian officers I served with overseas were just phenomenal, both of my deputies at Naval Forces Europe, Africa, and Allied Joint Force Command, Naples, were stellar Canadian officers who fought alongside us in Afghanistan. So hopefully we can move past and through this. Sherri, over to you. Any opinions on the Greenland and Canada discussions these days?
Well, you framed the question, Admiral, as taking the temperature. So let's just level set here. Temperatures continue to rise in the Arctic, 4 times the global average.
Yeah.
But yet relations with our closest allies have quite cooled. And Luke said it exceptionally well about the Canadians, our closest allies. They're very hurt. We depend on them, for so many things, so much trade and so much defense, tourism, and just family relations, as you both revealed. And so I think this is, important for us to keep in mind at this time, that this is, we need Canada to remain as our close neighbor and our close ally and our close friend. With respect to Greenland, I had the privilege of visiting Greenland this summer. It's a beautiful location. It really is, when you look at the map of North America, Alaska is our 10 and Greenland is our 2 o'clock. And so it is really, proximate to our continent. It's, as Luke said, once nonstop flights start this summer, it will be closer to get from New York to Nuuk than it will be to Iceland. And Iceland's less than 5 hours. So we're talking like 4 hours. It's quite close. And while Greenlanders say they're open for business, they've also said they're not open for sale. So I think that kind of frames it. They are interested in, potentially more tourism, although it's it has a very limited road network. And while the two of the major airports are being expanded to allow for additional flights, it still doesn't have the infrastructure yet for major tourism. And the Greenland ice cap still covers most of the center of the country, and while it continues to melt, it's not really ready for much more than coastal infrastructure at this point. But it is a beautiful place to visit. It has other economic and trade opportunities. I think we will begin to see closer ties between Greenland and the United States economically. They still, of course, depend very heavily on investment from Denmark for defense and security. And that's been important for us in the Arctic. When we think about protecting our Arctic, we think about, Greenland and Alaska and Canada, sort of our portion of the North American Arctic. And then you have the Russian Arctic. And in between, we have our very important, other NATO allies in Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, covering the rest of the Arctic. And, with Russia continuing to be an aggressor across Europe, we also have to be mindful that they have their eyes, as well as the Chinese, on other parts of the Arctic.
Absolutely. And I loved what you said about Alaska, 10 o'clock, Greenland, 2 o'clock. I've never actually set foot on the country of Greenland. I've only had periscope liberty around there. But I have been to Iceland, and I've seen the positive impact of increase in tourism in Iceland. I mean, the economy is booming, and no doubt about it, Greenland is seeing a lot more interest, and hopefully that'll be beneficial to them as we work through this diplomatic relationship with the Danes. Well, let's move on to something that we call Arctic exceptionalism. It's a term that's bandied about a lot, and it refers to the idea that Arctic states and stakeholders and citizens interact in the region largely without conflict. However, the Arctic has had a long history of militarization. So I'm going to move this picture over onto the screen briefly and show you that's my experience up in the Arctic in submarines. It started in June of 1985, and that is my first boat, the USS Sea Devil, which broke through the ice at the geographic Arctic Circle at the North Pole, the geographic North Pole. We spent about a day up there, had a lot of fun, hit golf balls off tees in the Arctic. My recommendation to you was don't use white balls. You'll never get them back. Range balls colored yellow work much better. And then we submerged, but we were up there for business, and that was deterrence during the Cold War and pushing back against any Russian aggression. And particularly the Russians had their bastions of ballistic missile submarines up there, so it was our job to keep America safe. So it's been militarized for quite a while. I mean, since Commodore Peary in the early part of the 20th century. So Luke, let me ask you, can you describe the role of the Arctic in either times of peace or times of war, and provide some context to the relationship between the United States and the Arctic Council nations that Sherri just rattled off today? So we'll get your opinion, then we'll ask Sherri.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just break it down to the most basic level of homeland defense. When it comes to the defense of the North American continent, places like Greenland are a matter of vital importance due to issues of physics, geometry, and geography. If you want missile defense, if you want air surveillance, if you want early warning systems, you have to be present in Greenland because of its location. So ultimately, it keeps us safe at home. I guess because I'm from the Afghan era of Army veterans. I view it as like I view Greenland and Iceland as the forward operating bases of the North American continent. And then I view, take it a next step out, Svalbard and Jan Mayen, which is two islands owned by Svalbard is a group of islands owned by Norway. Jan Mayen is an island also owned by Norway in the Arctic Ocean. I view these as the patrol bases. And we have to have a presence, whether it's a diplomatic, economic, scientific, military presence on these islands, because they're vital for the defense of North America. And they're also vital for the defense of Northern Europe and, by extension, NATO as an alliance. So we have to be involved in the region. I do believe in the idea of Arctic exceptionalism. I do believe that countries that have territory above the Arctic Circle have a shared sense of a shared set of common interests, goals, concerns, challenges that aren't faced by those who are not above the Arctic Circle. I'm not sure if we in the United States quite realize this yet. I love sharing a quote from William Seward, who was the Secretary of State that was responsible for purchasing Alaska. As he was entering the later last years of his life, he was asked what his greatest accomplishment was. And he said it was the purchase of Alaska, but it'll take more than a generation before anyone realizes it. And this is a man who was governor of New York, a senator from New York, Secretary of State at one of the most crucial times in American history. And yet he said this purchase of Alaska was the most defining moment of his career, of his life. And I think we're slowly waking up to this realization, but we haven't quite got there. And in terms of the military component, in addition to what I was saying about just the basic geometry, physics, and geography of the Arctic region to the defense of North America, there are unique challenges, as you will know better than anyone, having served up in above the Arctic Circle, when it comes to operating in this harsh environment. Equipment and material have to be hardened or especially prepared for extreme cold weather. The location of some of these regions so far north plays a problem with GPS and other radio frequencies and communication. These places are often very remote and lack search and rescue capabilities and situational awareness. I read recently that the last time some of the water lanes around Alaska were examined and marked was by Captain Cook in the 18th century. So we have to be able to operate in the Arctic region in the same way we have to operate in any other region. In the NATO context, we have to be able to defend Reykjavik in the same way we would defend Rome. But we don't quite view it that way, and we need to start thinking in this manner.
Yeah, great commentary. And before we go to Sherri, just a couple of things. I love the analogy, the Afghan analogy of forward operating bases, where we need to be, and then the patrol bases in Svalbard and Jan Mayen Island. I did Trident Juncture, the exercise in 2018, two of the coldest months of the year, and the Norwegians are not interested in any tension over those islands. And of course, the fisheries agreements with the Russians and everything else are very complicated. Second thing I would say on your commentary is the preparation and training for whether it's a cruise ship and most especially a Navy ship and a submarine to actually go up and navigate in the Arctic and spend an entire deployment up there is significant. We have an Arctic Ice Lab that does this in San Diego with ice pilots because the charts are not that good. NavOceano does a good job. NGA does a good job, but we don't have perfect charts in order to be able to navigate up there. And it's important that we increase our database of that information for our own security. And so it can be a pretty harsh environment. Now, things are changing as we see more blue water and less ice, but let me shift over to Sherri and see what her comments are on, the militarization of the Arctic. How do we deal with that? Maybe a comment on the indigenous peoples up there, because I'm sure they would just prefer the great powers cool it and leave them alone. What do you say, Sherri?
Well, thank you, Admiral. And let me start by saying, I had the privilege in my book, Threat Multiplier, to tell your story of being up with the sea devil and popping up into the ice early on in your career as a submariner, and then your experience later on when you found less ice, more blue water and even plastic waste as an example of how the region is changing.
Sad.
And I had my own, experiences in the Arctic early on in the early post-Cold War era when I was serving in the Department of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense walked down to my office one day, which is not something he usually did. I usually went to his office.
Which one was that?
Secretary Bill Perry.
Oh, no kidding.
And he said to me, Sherri, I just met with the Norwegian defense minister, and he says one of the most important things we can do in U.S.-Norwegian defense relations is engage the Russians to ensure that they are decommissioned and sinking nuclear submarines in Murmansk don't pose a threat to Norwegian fishing grounds. And he said, that's the problem. Over to you to figure out how to fix it. So from there, we created with Norway and Russia and the United States, what we called the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program. And that program succeeded in helping the Russians build a cask to safely offload the liquid waste streams from those approximately 100 sunken Russian submarines in Murmansk so it could be shipped inland for safer storage. Now, we weren't doing it primarily for the sake of the environment. We were doing it because our NATO ally, Norway, cared deeply about it. Also because we cared about safety in the region and the safety of those sunken submarines. And it was a time when we used all elements of national power to ensure that we could continue to successfully operate in that region. So science, environmental engagement, diplomacy, and also bringing in, as you mentioned, the indigenous people of the region who are the major population. In fact, the Greenlanders, Canadians, and our Alaskans all share the common Inuit heritage. They are in many ways the front line of domain awareness in a changing Arctic. And we depend very much on their knowledge and their experience to help us understand how threats to our homeland are changing today. And so when we think about operating in a changing Arctic, particularly in the Alaskan Arctic, which still continues to be relatively sparsely populated up in the U.S. Arctic, we very much depend on the indigenous people to be part of that forward force, along, of course, with our own military bases and our own other assets in the region. But they are, between Greenland, Iceland, Svalbard, where I've also had the privilege to visit. These are our eyes and ears and our eyes in the sky, really. These are our eyes in the sky to understand threats coming at the U.S. homeland and other malign activities that might occur in the region. So it's important that those relationships remain constructive for all of our allies, and that even at a time when we've gone from an era of more cooperation to one of more competition, we manage that in a way that protects America's interest.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sherri. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about AMEC and your work there on keeping the Arctic from becoming contaminated in a moment. But let's do a quick kind of historical deep dive on Greenland and look at the impact of climate change for the future as far as foreign policy and security is concerned. So Greenland, as Luke identified, is a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, not unlike Puerto Rico here in the United States. The American explorer, Rear Admiral Robert Peary, once thought that a channel separated northeastern Greenland from the rest of the landmass, putting the Northeast within American coastal waters. So that's a claim that the United States has made since the early part of the 20th century. There was an expedition by Danish explorer Einar Mikkelsen in a very good movie that was just released within the last year called Against the Ice. If you get a chance to watch it, I think it's on Netflix, which disproved this claim back in 1909. And Mikkelsen almost died doing it. He was abandoned up there on a dog sled with one other crew member, and they had to make do and live until they were rescued with an expedition that came in about 2 years later. Phenomenal story. Greenland received home rule in 1979. More power was transferred to the Greenlandic government in 2008 in the most recent referendum. And the Danish government still controls areas, including security policy and foreign affairs, but there's a growing momentum towards independence. And that has fed some of the interest in Greenland in a draft constitution, which hasn't been adopted yet, I don't think, but it was written back in 2023. So as we look at all this and we look at climate change, Sherri, let me ask you, what do you think the future impact of climate change, like Greenland becoming more green, less glacier, less ice, in the future on both foreign policy and national security? Keeping in mind, Luke pointed out, we have bases up there. Thule, Greenland, where the big radar is for early warning, used to be an Air Force facility. Now it's the Space Force that's monitoring it.
Right. We've long had a very critical military base in Northwest Greenland, formerly called Thule, now called Patuxent Space Base. It's important for America's national security. As we look at climate changes in the Arctic, in Greenland in particular, with the massive Greenland ice sheet, which still covers most of the center of Greenland, but is melting at a rapid rate. And if you visit Greenland, you can go up on the ice sheet, but the place where you would normally helicopter down and land to walk on the ice sheet just a few years ago, now you land far from the ice sheet because it's retreated so much. And so you're on actually rocky, sandy soil. And when you visit, as you do most often, visit most of the area by boat, you see actually more icebergs in the fjords because of the calving and the melting of the glaciers. So it's actually more complicated to navigate there now than it had been because the Arctic is rapidly melting. And I think it's important also for your listeners to know, that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So as the Arctic is melting, and particularly the Greenland and then the vast Antarctic ice sheet, that is contributing to sea level rise around the globe. And so what we experience from Maine to Miami is partly because of ice melt at both poles. And when we see this whipsaw of temperatures, often in the winter, the polar vortex, that's also because of changing atmospheric conditions in the Arctic brought around by warming temperatures. So with the changes in Greenland, and with more commercial activities, we actually see, as you noted, Greenland has been an autonomous region of Denmark since 1979, increasingly gaining home rule, has been looking to have its own presence. For example, it's had a consulate in Washington for some time with representatives, and they are engaged in commercial and other trade and tourist activities in the United States, and they're able to do that increasingly independent of the Danish government, but there still is a close relationship. And when you're in Greenland, you realize how the cultures have intertwined and intermixed over the years. There is a very strong Danish intermix in the presence, and there's also, very importantly, the investment they get in infrastructure and for their defense and security. So I think Greenlanders increasingly want to determine their own destiny, but they want to determine it on their own terms, not dictated by any actually outside power, although they want to continue, I think, those relationships. As you said, they have an important referendum and elections coming up later this year. So we'll see, as they have the ability to increasingly determine their own future, will they continue on a stable path, or will they make a bigger break? And I think only they know how they see their future.
Yep, absolutely. And that's politics. You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's First Alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners. Well, I want to move forward into another area of the world, but it comes back to haunt us in the Arctic. So a friend of the center, a friend of mine, Dr. Bridge Colby, is nominee for the very powerful position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at OSD. He's written a great book, Deterrence by Denial, and it's about shifting focus to the Western Pacific, to China. But China may be a threat in a number of areas and treaty allies out in the Western Pacific, but China is also present in the Arctic. Xi Jinping has called China a near Arctic nation. And the best response to that, I think, is from the independent Senator Angus King, who said, well, if China, which it doesn't come anywhere close to the Arctic, it's 900 miles from any place from the Arctic Ocean to the tip of Chinese territory. If they're a near Arctic nation, then the state of Maine is a near Caribbean state. And I love that. There's PLA Navy warships operating up in Bering Sea. And it's only a matter of time, I've said this before, that the Chinese operate a submarine in the Arctic and perhaps harden a sail and surface at the North Pole so that they can plant a flag and claim that they're just like us and the Russians. In 2018, 10 different parties, some countries and entities like the European Union, signed the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which has a 16-year mandate to prevent or mitigate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in the Arctic. Now, China doesn't have a good track record here. So it's got a distant water fishing fleet that's all over the globe. And there are constant violations of people's economic zones and sovereignty and overfishing. So let me ask you both, and I'll start with Luke. Are you worried about China in the Arctic? And are you worried about compliance with the CAOFA in the Arctic on the part of China and fishing?
Well, in general terms, I'm worried about China anywhere in the world. And I do not have any faith that China will live up to any international commitment or agreement, whether it's about fishing or energy or global health, any of these matters. But that being said, I think we also have to understand what China's goals and objectives are in the Arctic region, at least right now. And then we have to develop our policies to better counter and deter this. I mean, for example, the first time I went to Greenland, I had thought that I was going to need a Mandarin phrase book, right? Like you read all this stuff, you hear about what China's doing, and then I get there and I didn't knowingly see a single Chinese person. Perhaps I walked past one, I didn't realize it, but it's not as if they were heavily involved in Greenland with investments. They don't have a consulate there like we do. Other places around the Arctic, they are more involved. Iceland, for example, there's been some concerns. In Greenland, China has tried to get involved more, whether it's through investments in different airport projects or purchasing an old naval base. But these have been blocked by the Danish and Greenlandic authorities. So at least the system is working to keep malign Chinese influence out of Greenland. But China certainly sees itself as a player in the Arctic, based on this dubious notion, as you alluded to, that it's a so-called near Arctic state. I do like Senator King's analogy. I would also say that if China is a near Arctic state using by its measurement, then that means Kazakhstan, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, the UK, and Ireland are also near Arctic states. And in reality, the one country in the world that's the closest to the Arctic without actually not being above the Arctic Circle is the United Kingdom. So really, there's only one country that can, with the Shetland Islands north of Scotland. There's only one country that can really claim near Arctic state, and that's the UK, in my opinion. But China, they've been so effective at communicating this, especially before the pandemic, when I was regularly attending the the Arctic conference scene, different conferences and summits. They were so active, whether it's through funding, through speakers. They somehow got all the top key speaking slots. They say all the right things that all the more liberally minded, progressive Arctic activists want to hear. They will talk about the importance of the environment in the Arctic. They talk about the importance of multilateralism in the Arctic and international law and norms. If you read the Chinese Arctic strategy in its English language version, it's littered with these phrases, these catchphrases. But the irony shouldn't be lost on anyone when they see that China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, or that China regularly ignores international laws and norms in places like the South China Sea. Now, with China right now, I think their main motivation is mainly economic, looking for new markets and access to new markets, faster access, quicker access to different global markets using the Northern Sea route. They see energy as a key issue, and this is where Russia is playing a role, especially in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Scientific research is also a major role for major motivation for China in the Arctic. And then there is a military component to all of this, dual use science exploration on what meteorological research that can both impact civilian use but also military use in the region. I do believe China's doing this, but in terms of being actually active above the Arctic Circle, I think there's very limited open source intelligence that shows us that the PLA in the People's Liberation Army Navy has been active above the Arctic Circle. We know they've been in the Bering Strait and been off the coast of Alaska, but operating above the Arctic Circle. But certainly dual use, like so-called scientific vessels that have a military and civilian application have been involved in the region. On one more point on this, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a double-edged sword for China in the Arctic. On one hand, China lost its most important multilateral platform that it would use to push its agenda, and that is the Arctic Council. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, the Arctic Council has basically ceased functioning. So China, which is an observer, has lost that platform to try to shape and influence the debate. But on the other hand, they've gotten closer to Russia in the region, and they know that Russia is more dependent on them, so they can leverage more out of that relationship with Moscow in the Arctic region. So we certainly need to keep an eye on what China's doing up north, but we shouldn't also blow it out of proportion, because China, frankly, is a bigger threat in other places around the world to the United States and its interests.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Just a couple quick comments. Your comments on us having consulates up in and embassies, of course, in Arctic Council states, and also a consulate in Greenland, as opposed to the Chinese not, is important. If you go to Africa and some of the places I've traveled, West Africa, North Africa, there are Chinese cultural centers, these Confucius cultural centers everywhere. And a lot of people are learning Mandarin and receiving stipends and scholarships, and particularly the military, to go and study in some of the Chinese military schools. So fortunately, we're not seeing that up there. Right on the Bering Strait, the Chinese are operating there. They have a lot of Costco shipping traffic going back and forth. They use that route more than we do because we're deep draft and they're not, but they can cut off a significant amount of transit time to Europe. But I think, and people have disagreed with me on this, when I say it's a provocative statement, one day they'll have a submarine surface at the North Pole. If they really want to project the image of being a near Arctic nation, then that's part of it. because the United States does that, Russia does that, and I could see China being envious and wanting to do the same thing, or at least operate up in the marginal ice zone or closer to the pack ice with one of their nuclear boats or with one of their diesel boats. And when that happens, as always, I think we're going to be surprised. So,
I agree totally. I think it's just a matter of time.
yeah. So let me ask Sherri for a comment on derivation of this theme. Sherri, with China's interest up there and the push to try to get a base and complete one belt, one road in the Arctic, do you think that's the driver for the current administration's interest in the Arctic, or are there other factors at play? And is there a way to blunt Chinese interest or prevent Chinese expansionism into the Arctic, or is that even appropriate?
Well, such a good question, Admiral. And you mentioned Bridge Colby, who also was my colleague at CNA, Center for Naval Analysis.
Really smart guy.
For 14
Love
years.
Him. Yeah.
And we also did a study that was at CNA that was led about 5 or so years ago by Mark Rosen, Navy retired,
Sure.
who I'm sure you know, who looked at Chinese foreign direct investment in the Arctic at that time and really benchmarked the extent of Chinese investment across the region, particularly in Iceland, but in other parts of the Arctic and with their Arctic ambitions, even into Alaska, offering to build pipelines. And certainly, let's not forget that they're also trying to build out fiber optic cables and work with companies in the region. So that communication's very highly vital to our networks and to our ability to communicate in the region. I think China is very serious about its Arctic ambitions. It was clear since their 2018 first Arctic policy that their Polar Silk Road envisions a future. Now it's a long term, they have a strategic plan. It's not going to be realized right away. As Luke noted, it's been the Russia's aggression, against Ukraine has had some ups and downs, and the shipping across the Northern Sea Route has not reached the tonnage that President Putin has set for it. But I think China is learning with Russia how to operate in the Arctic. They're certainly interested and have invested in extracting energy from Yamal. China operates the largest illegal fishing fleet in the world. And we know that as fish stocks are depleted across the equatorial regions, a combination of illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, plus the fact that with warming ocean temperatures, fish stocks are moving towards both poles. And in fact, one of the reasons that Russia and Norway some 5 years ago were able to fairly successfully conclude an agreement on what might have been a dispute about their fishing grounds on their in their maritime regions is because there's so much productivity in those fish. The Arctic cod and other species are quite abundant right now. That won't necessarily always be the case, but that Central Arctic fishing moratorium that you mentioned does give China the opportunity to conduct science and research. I want to put that a little bit in air quotes because we know there's a dual use interest in China's operating in that region to both understand changing maritime conditions, changing ocean conditions, improve its ability to operate in the region. And I think if we think of China as being in somewhat of a race for global resources, we know with the Belt and Road Initiative, both energy and infrastructure, we can see that fish is going to be an important future resource, potentially in the Arctic. Again, that's not, this year, that's not even 5 years from now, but they are patient and they are planning. And then with a combination of, we see Chinese and Russian military exercises off the coast of Alaska at various times that have even forced our own American fishing fleets to move out of harm's way. We could see that, they're ready and they're getting prepared to operate not only in their economic interest, but to extend their political and maybe, as you say, even their military influence even further in future years.
Thank you, Sherri. Let's go back and talk a little bit about something that you mentioned in your book. You also mentioned it here in an earlier question, and that is the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program. So Robert Perry came down and challenged you, put you in charge. You went out there and you did magnificent work. AMEC ran from 1995 to 2006, and it cleaned up toxic waste from sunken Russian nuclear submarines. So, as I was going through my career during the Cold War, the Russians lost a new class of submarine called the Mike. And that was tragic and interesting. And she's in a Davy Jones locker very deep in the ocean. So, chances of leakage are minimal. They also lost the Kursk, and that was a spectacular event that took place with, sailors that were still alive on the ship, but the Russians, and they didn't want anybody's help, couldn't get them out. And so for years and years, their philosophy on nuclear-powered warships was just, when we're done with them, just run them aground someplace and leave them. And since these things are covered by metal and metal rust, that's a potentially environmental problem. So how bad was it? And do you have an example for us of a cleanup or something that you did to get these things either out of the water or in a place where they were safe?
Well, as I said, thank you very much for that. Yes, I mean, it is concerning that, we have a lot of former Russian submarines now sunken in parts of the world, and we don't know exactly what condition they're in. It was so tragic, the loss of life of those sailors on the Kursk submarine. Of course, the United States has never had such an incident, and we wouldn't. It also keeps you up at night thinking about their nuclear safety record as they continue to militarize and nuclearize across the Arctic. One of the things we did in the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program was we were tracking and examining and testing the waters for contamination. And what's interesting is that often the hazardous waste contamination is more problematic even than the radioactive waste, radioactive leaks potentially because of the half-life. So that's something that we will continue to have to test for, I think, in future years, particularly with changing water conditions. It's not an area that's receiving, I think, a lot of attention right now. But it's one that, you never know when you might have an incident that could lead to increased attention to this matter. During those years after the Cold War, we were exchanging environmental information and other scientific information with the Russians. In fact, we exchanged, we shared with them information we had about contamination at one of their military bases that we had from our declassified imagery. And then they shared with us information they had about one of our American military bases. And so there was a time when the science diplomacy across the region was in full flourish. And, that's also been an important component, I think, of confidence building, of reducing risk in the Arctic, and also of understanding those changing conditions, because we know as the ice melts in certain parts of the Arctic, now it's uncovered prior hazardous waste, or we've seen even anthrax. So there are these risks that could increasingly occur, particularly with permafrost thaw and collapse. And, we have some permafrost thaw and collapse across the American and even Canadian Arctic, but I'm probably much more concerned about that in Russia, because Russia's much more industrialized in its Arctic, and it is built probably not to Western standards infrastructure that, as it thaws and collapses, could result in more hazardous and ecologically devastating conditions. The question will be, how localized will they be in that region, or could they spread? And I think we don't really know the answer to that yet.
Thanks very much, Sherri, and thanks for mentioning the fact that the United States Navy nuclear power program, since its inception in the 1950s with Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, and all the submarines and all the nuclear-powered ships, including cruisers and carriers that we build, has an exceptional safety record. Exceptionally
great record.
Yeah,
I think we should be proud of that as Americans.
Yeah, I think so too. It goes unnoticed, but that's the model that everybody else in the world should be emulating. Okay, shifting gears, we're going to talk about Finland and Canada and the Icebreaker Collaboration Efforts, or the ICE Pact, which is an initiative to advance icebreaker development through shared resources and expertise. It's highly necessary. So we have one icebreaker, one big icebreaker left, the Polar Star. There is a sister ship which is being used as parts. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy, a medium icebreaker, caught fire last summer, and it's in repair right now. We've leased another vessel, but we've allowed our icebreaker fleet to atrophy, as opposed to Europe. And I'm going to put up a picture here. This is a picture of me breaking ice in an ice sculpture on board a Finnish icebreaker in Helsinki, Finland, as a guest of Admiral Foggo Typollis. He ran a Chiefs of European Navies conference that rotates every year. We went up there, and he thought it would be cool to do the icebreaker on board an icebreaker. And so that's what we did, and everybody got a chance to carve ice. So the Finns have an incredible icebreaker fleet, and for about a 250 million bucks, they can build you an icebreaker that's state of the art. We have been trying to get the national polar security cutter built now since about 2019. It's currently in Bollinger shipyards. It's been set back a little bit. We need to get that ship out and deployed before 2030. Finland is now one of the newest members of NATO. And so, Luke, you've stated that NATO should have a stronger position in the Arctic. How does the ice pack change things, and how might Canada and Iceland, in cooperation with the United States, alleviate this lack or gap or seam of icebreakers in U.S. inventory?
Yeah, well, it is quite extraordinary that a country like ours, an Arctic power, the Coast Guard has effectively one large icebreaker in operation. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. I believe that in the Arctic, sovereignty equals security. And that means respecting the sovereignty of others while also being able to defend and enforce your own sovereignty. And without tools like icebreakers, it makes it a lot harder for the United States. Now, I know last summer, alongside the NATO summit here in Washington, D.C., there was this announcement of this icebreaker collaboration effort between the U.S., Canada, and Finland. But honestly, I'm very skeptical about this because of the protectionist tendencies that we still have in the United States when it comes to shipping. There's something called the Jones Act, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. I'm not sure if the listeners will be, but it's basically a piece of protectionist legislation from the 1920s, which in simple terms states that any ship that is going from one U.S. port to another U.S. port and also carrying U.S. passengers or goods has to be built in America. So this is really the biggest problem with buying off the shelf from our partners like Finland, who make fantastic icebreakers at reasonable prices. Our own laws prevent us from doing this, and this is why we haven't done it. How this does or does not impact the initiative announced last summer isn't quite clear to me because no one's really addressed this issue. Everyone kind of talks around it. But as far as I can tell, the Jones Act will continue to be a limiting factor here. Unfortunately, one of the greatest champions of repealing the Jones Act is no longer with us, and that was the late, great Senator McCain. So I think we have to maybe look at some of the legislation that's on the books to allow us to have more flexibility to purchase icebreakers that we need off the shelf. In terms of the role of NATO, I've been going on for years about NATO needing a role in the Arctic, not because there's any heightened threat of warfare or conflict in the Arctic, which actually I think there's a reduced threat. I mean, I don't see an imminent, war breaking out in the region, but because NATO has just over the years decided to ignore the region, even though it's part of its area of responsibility. This is mainly down to a bilateral or an internal dispute between, in its simplest form, Norway and Canada. Norway wants more NATO involvement in the region. Canada thinks this is something that should be left at the nation state level, the member state level, and they don't want NATO as involved. I personally saw this play out in Lisbon at the Lisbon summit in 2010, when the strategic concept was being agreed. And at the time, I was working for the British delegation. I was working for the British Defense Secretary, and he was asked to broker a deal between his Norwegian and Canadian counterparts on agreed language for that strategic concept, so they could include the word Arctic in it, so they could address the Arctic. In 2010, this NATO strategic concept was meant to focus on future threats and challenges. But he failed in this endeavor. And if you go back and look at this document from 2010, NATO doesn't mention the Arctic at all because no agreement could be made. Fast forward to 2022 at the most recent strategic concept, and you finally get the first reference to the Arctic in any NATO official document in recent memory. There was a mention to the High North, which anyone who follows Arctic issues, that has Norway's fingerprints all over it. And then since 2022, in every summit declaration, there has been a reference to the Arctic. Whereas in the past, if you went back and you looked at a summit declaration from previous years, these things run 20 pages long. Yeah. You open them up, hit Control F, type in the word Arctic, and you wouldn't find it. But now you do. So I think NATO is realizing that it can't ignore this region. Arctic, especially with Finland and Sweden in the alliance, you have to confront the challenges in the region, and it has to be part of the alliance military planning and thinking.
Thank you very much, Luke. And, very interesting commentary. I have to respond on the point of the Jones Act. Understand what you're saying. We've studied a lot here. The Navy League is a proponent of the Jones Act. And one of the things that I think is value added is in time of war, it's almost like a war reserve where you have a U.S. ship, U.S. flag, U.S. crew, which we probably wouldn't trust to Costco or Chinese carrier to get beans and bullets to the troops. But there is a need.
But allies like Finland, partners, you would, I think, if we're in the same security alliance, I think you could have to put some level of trust.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think that's, that was the whole reason for that line of questioning on the ice pact is, can we get this done? At the time when I was out carving ice on the Finnish icebreaker, there was discussion with Secretary Spencer as Secretary of the Navy of whether we should lease some of these vessels.
Right. That's what I was going to add. I think that might still be a Jones Act workaround, and the lease could provide a way to bridge the gap. There'd obviously have to be political will in the U.S. to do that. But, let me also observe, Luke, you recounted well the history of NATO in the Arctic, but I think it has changed a lot in the last decade, because I think NATO is unified now in the light of increasing Russian aggression in Europe. That also extends into malign activities among our High North allies, and to even activities with China, as we noted, military activities off Alaska, that we need to have not only an Arctic presence, but we need to be coordinated as NATO allies. And I had the privilege of attending and being part of the first NATO Arctic Strategic Foresight exercise conducted in Norway in 2019. And that included, of course, the Canadians. And I think since then, we've seen, as NATO has experienced increasing climate change throughout its, by all of its members, we have to be prepared to confront this risk wherever it is. And in the Arctic, now NATO has a very forward-leaning climate security action plan and includes the Arctic. The first NATO Climate and Security Center of Excellence just opened in Canada, in Montreal this year. Norway and many of our Arctic nations are present in that. So I think we're seeing kind of a renewed focus and willingness to address this whole set of risks we face in the region.
Thank you very much, Sherri. And we're almost out of time here, so I do want to give both my guests an opportunity for the last word. And I would just ask the teaser, is there anything that we forgot to discuss on the Arctic today? We've done everything from soups to nuts, icebreakers to Greenland to Canada to, passage through the Arctic, receding ice, fish. Luke, anything on your mind that should have been a higher priority in the discussion?
Well, not higher priority, but I do think that because of the situation in Ukraine with Russia, that we have to start thinking, and because of the fact that now all of the Arctic powers other than Russia are under the same security umbrella. I think we might need to look at ways to find deeper cooperation with the Arctic Council not functioning. I know Russia is a key part of the Arctic. It consists of half of the world's Arctic coastline. I know that an oil spill in Russia will impact other places around the world, but the reality is Russia is not a trustworthy partner, and we have to continue with the progress of cooperation, scientific advancement, environmentalism, indigenous peoples issues, and we can't let the fact that the Arctic Council isn't functioning properly stop us from doing this. So I think we might need to create, even if they're temporary, parallel institutions.
Excellent point. Sherri, over to you for the last word.
Yeah, look, I want to agree with you on that. I think it's vitally important that we remain engaged with our Arctic allies and partners so that we understand the full scope of changes throughout the Arctic and that we're prepared to defend and deter against a variety of threats from Russia to China to other threats that may emerge in the Arctic. And I just want to, in the last word, draw attention to my book. Thank you, Threat Multiplier. Climate military leadership and the fight for global security. You can hear Admiral Foggo's stories in it, as well as other great admirals from Admiral Locklear, Admiral Stavridis, and many other generals and military leaders who are on the front lines of a changing world today. And so thank you very much, Admiral, for having us.
Well, so well said, and what a great wrap-up. And folks, that's it. Thank you to Mr. Luke Coffey and Sherri Goodman for joining us at Maritime Nation today. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here can be found on our website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org, all lowercase. Thanks to Dataminr for the sponsorship and support. And thank you to James Peterson, our sound engineer, and Ava Moore, our new intern, for producing today's program. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation. That'll be with the Italians and the Italian Strike Group Commander, Admiral Cipriani, who took the Italian carrier Cavour with the F-35 and a couple of Frem-class frigates to the Pacific to be aligned with the United States in pushback against Chinese aggression. So thanks very much. See you next time out here.